and we are introduced to a new definition mathematically, and that definition that we have to know is defined. So we have to know the definition of defined, right? What it is mathematically is asking when something exists or doesn't exist, okay? When something exists, we use the word defined, and when it does not exist, mathematically we say it's undefined. Okay? Now this is going to come up guaranteed when we do our quiz on radicals. Someone's going to put up their hand and say, what does defined mean? And I'm going to say, go back in your notes. So when we did example 3, it's even on YouTube. I can prove that I taught you what this word was. It's asking where it exists. Now, some things don't exist mathematically. And we talked about it already. You are not allowed to do what with square roots? Can't have a negative inside a square root. This would be undefined. You can have a square root inside a cube root. I mean, you can have a negative inside of a cube root because a negative times a negative times a negative stays negative. So what we have is, if there's an even number and then a value inside of a radical, it is only defined when x is bigger than or equal to 0. Does that make sense? Only if x is a positive number will it be defined. However, if we have an odd number, and then a value inside, it will always be defined. And we would say that x could be any real number. That's the way that we would say that x is always defined. And the first one, x can only be bigger than or equal to 0. Yes? Even number are numbers, and odd numbers are like that. So then, depending what variable we have inside, what we're really asking, first of all, is it an odd index or is it an even index? Because if it's an odd index, it's an easy question. You can just say it's everything. It's always defined. If it's an even index, then you have to ask yourself, when are my numbers inside positive? When are my numbers inside negative? If they're always positive, then it's always defined. If it's always negative, it's never defined. So I'll show you a couple examples here. We might even do a couple more than this, just to get used to the idea. So for A, the first thing we see, we have a square root. So we have an even example. So we have to ask, are our numbers ever going to be negative inside? No. Why not? Because whatever number you put in for x, even if you put in -5 for x, what happens to x in this first example? It's going to change to positive because it's going to get squared. So if I put a -5 in, it's going to be -5 times -5, and you'll get positive 25. If I put in a positive number, like a 3, 3 times 3 will still be positive. Okay? So for A, you look at it, you make a mental note that it's always positive. So when is it defined? It is always defined, and we would say that by saying x can be any number. Because inside will always be positive. For B. Yes, Chris. It needs that extra line to show that that's the symbol for real numbers. So in the second one, again, we have an even index. So we have to check, is it always positive, or is it always negative, or where does it change? Okay? Unlike the first example, I can figure out a number that's not going to work. For example, if I put in 2, order of operations would say do 2 cubed first, and 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. And then I'd have to multiply by the negative 12, and I would get negative 96. And that would give me a negative inside my fourth root, and that would be undefined. So 2 is bad. Okay? I don't expect you to write out all numbers, all infinite amount of numbers, and start checking them off in X and mode. We start to see that there's a key number of where things change. It's going to change at 0, right? Because when I plug in 0, 0 is okay. Because 0 cubed is 0. Negative 12 times 0 is 0. And the cube root of 0 is what times what times what is 0? 0. So basically what you're going to check is, well, the difference is between positive numbers and negative numbers. Which ones are okay and which ones are bad? If I plug in a positive number, and we checked that already by plugging in 2, that was bad. That is undefined. Can you see that any positive number that you put in, you'll have a positive times a positive times a positive, and then that gets multiplied by a negative, will always give you a negative number. So that'll be undefined. If you plug in a negative number for x, if you plug in a negative number for x, like negative 3, you'd have negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3, which would give you negative 27, and then you multiply by negative 12. And a negative times a negative is positive, so this works. Negative numbers will be defined, because when you plug in a negative number, the math will say that you will get a positive number inside the radical, and that'll work. So the way we would write all of our negative numbers is we would say that x has to be less than or equal to 0. And that is where it's defined. Example 4, it could be 0 because you can take the cube root of 0. Because cube root of 0 is 0. So that's why it can equal 0 as well. Yes? Negative 0 isn't a number.